And hello to our online audience. We're very glad to welcome you here this evening to the Royal Asiatic Society. I'm Susan Whitfield. I'm a council member of the Society, and very pleased maybe to see some new faces, I hope. We encourage you all to join us. We give lectures for free to all and hold other events here, so it's always nice to see new faces. I'm delighted this evening to be introducing an old friend and colleague, Paul Wordsworth. Paul is lecturer in Silk Road Archaeology and Heritage at the Institute of Archaeology, just down the road at UCL, University College London. Paul has researched and written extensively on Central Asia and caravanserai and desert routes, having travelled there a lot and having carried out quite a lot of field research there and archaeological research, two of the main sites of which are in Afghanistan, Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan now. And I think you're working in Turkmenistan with the Met, is that correct? Yeah, on a site. So you can ask him questions about after. He, I'm glad to say, is going to challenge a bit about the idea of the Silk Road today, which is always good to hear, Silk Road person. So we'll have a lecture and then there'll be a bit of time for questions afterwards. So just prepare your questions as we go along. So pathways, pastoralism and power. Delighted that you could come this evening, Paul, and the floor's yours.
I should keep this on hand. I might be sort of waving it about at various points. But what I will do is leave it on the side if later on if you want to have a look at it. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak. It's a real honour and a pleasure to be here and also to speak in front of people who really do know this area. I often have to introduce Central Asia to my students at least and to other audiences, but I think many of the people in this room will be familiar with at least the broader context of the area that I'm going to talk about, not least Turkmenistan, which will feature, at least the lands within the modern nation of Turkmenistan will feature quite heavily in today's talk. And this is in fact part of the landscape of the Karakum, the Black Sands in modern day Turkmenistan. And actually one thing I should point out is that on several of these photos, you'll notice the name Alexis Pantos. He was my photographer throughout the course of my research. It's his excellent photos that should hopefully entertain you, even if I go off a little bit adrift. Okay. Yes, I hesitated as to whether to include the S word. It wasn't in the title, purposefully, and it isn't in the title of the book. However, everything that we do, as you will all know, in terms of travel, routes, and the connectivity, big scare quotes, of Central Asia is framed within this narrative. You simply can't get away from it. And a lot of people have lambasted the idea of Silk Roads, and it's really come under fire, particularly in the last 20 years, in terms of what it represents. I'd like to give it a little bit more of a sort of positive gloss, actually, to start with at least, in the sense that by the time we've moved between the Silk Roads, the book that I should have written, but Peter Frankopan got there first. I'd be far wealthier. And the British Museum exhibition, of course, last year, you see a paradigm shift in people's understanding, not just of the concept of Silk Roads, but the focus on Central Asia itself and Central Asian nations, which I think is absolutely critical and something which can absolutely be applauded. So we have this much more dynamic, much more engaged notion of Silk Roads, and actually a broader knowledge now in the general public about Central Asia and travel in the past and what it represents. So in general terms, we are in a better place. However, what I want to tackle tonight is something that gets to the heart of why maps like this are misleading. Now, this is a UNESCO map. It's a somewhat dated UNESCO map of where the Silk Roads go. And I often show it to my students with reference to the fact that UNESCO was really interested in the Silk Roads right at the fall of the Soviet Union, right? They were interested in the Silk Roads in the end of the 80s, and that's no mistake. They saw an opportunity to see the former Soviet Union as a connected entity and to use soft power to try and encourage countries to talk to each other across this mass, and they did so through the lens of Silk Road. In doing so, what they did is they created these a priori corridors, these pathways and these routes, and they did so on the basis of cities, which is the logical starting point, in fact, for any discussion of major trade, because, of course, who consumes luxury items? Urbanites. It's the people in the cities who actually want to consume this stuff. And so therefore, if you want to understand the routes, you connect the cities with various different lines. And you could draw, I have a whole collection, I have a folder on my computer of different Silk Road maps. You could draw them any which way. The problem with this is that it gives a false understanding of what those routes actually are and where those pathways went. And this was really the starting point of my research, because I wanted to understand not just where the pathways went and why they were there, but what it represents in terms of bigger questions. Okay, in terms of archaeology, it's bigger questions. I'm going to go a little bit theoretical, just briefly, and then I'll bring us back to the evidence. Because the Silk Road, in very, very broad terms, at the moment, I feel falls into two general models. The first is what I call here Model 1. And that is that we have empires. I don't need to stress probably which empires I'm referring to, but empires on the edge who grow very wealthy. They desire for these luxury objects, and they use interlocutors in the middle as traders, as people who move between, who understand how to bargain basically with these larger political entities. Writ large, the Sogdians. The Sogdians, I mean, I've given Jenny Rose's article here, but you can look at Etienne de la Bessière, and they are always characterized as these go-betweens, these traders in between the two. And so this is our Model 1. What does it look like in artifact terms? Well, this means what you have on the one end is the production of an item, in theory. On the other end, the consumption of the item, or the elite display of the item. And in the middle, these interlocutors are the recipients, is very much how it's framed, of a blended culture, be it syncretism, be it art historical signatures in this form. So that's Model 1. Model 2 is when these empires expand. Now, I put Peter Bang's article just for your reference, but you can all imagine what happens when empires feel a greater need for these traded items. They expand into the volume and they push out the interlocutors. And it's a different system. It's a different system because at this point, the empires are doing the trading, they're doing the moving, and it's not the people in the center. And so you have empires face to face with each other. To give you an example, in real terms, in terms of Silk Roads at least, you have the production and consumption of ceramics, and I'd say with somewhat sort of caveated, the ships which sail between empires or large political entities to provide these vessels which have been deliberately produced, supply and demand, for the Abbasid Caliphate. In this instance, these are ceramics that were excavated from Samarra in Baghdad, in Iraq. And this is a completely different system because you have that direct, I would argue, imperial interaction. So just to sort of summarize this again, brief theoretical position, in Model 1, what we're dealing with is these dynamic systems of supply and demand. You have to have the supply within the empires that is then allowing for those interlocutors to actually make a profit from doing the business that they do, bringing things back and forwards. In Model 2, you have direct control of that. The empires decide what will be imported, where will it go, how will it function. There's a difference potentially in the cultural mixing, although I don't want to get too far into that. There's also potentially a difference in the economic system which underlies it in terms of risk. There is a higher risk if you're dependent on that middleman to produce your goods. There's a lower risk if you actually control it. There's potentially, and again, the lower you get, the more question marks there are, there's potentially a divide there in terms of you start off with a system with lots and lots of middlemen and lots of different pathways, and you move towards a system where it's more about empires. The question mark is what happens after the Mongols, obviously, but that's another question. So the point that I want to address today is really, how does this affect on our notion of routes? Because in Model 1, routes and roads are based on economic advantage. They are there because they are pathways which provide the least cost to get goods from A to B, and they are navigated by those interlocutors who understand the paths. In model 2, you have pathways which are expedient politically. You have pathways which are based on the control of particular routes and the empires who control them. And so what I'm trying to do through this is sort of demonstrate this link between not just where the roads go, the logic of the roads, but the fact that they link into very different power structures. And this is what I was trying to look at in my research. There are a few really big assumptions here, and I think we'll come back to them at the very end. The first is that routes equals trade. There are many reasons why people travel that are nothing to do with trade. And yet we focus on trade. Why? Because it's visible archaeologically. We can see exotic goods, lapis lazuli being the best example. Trade in this model is not necessarily uniform and systematic. It is erratic. It is, as I will argue later on, seasonal. And it's not necessarily systematic in the sense that people are not necessarily turning out the most profit that they can for the goods available. And finally, we have to question this idea, and this is what I'll come to at the very end, is that the trading power itself is necessarily linked to state power, that the primary driver of trade is the state machinery itself. The things to bear in mind. Right, with that, I will turn to Central Asia proper. Now, Bregle's Atlas is a wonderful resource for Central Asia. What it isn't is very legible. So in terms of the lines, partly because the polities of Central Asia in the first millennium CE are incredibly complex, understandably. But I only put these maps up to highlight one thing, and that is in the pre-Islamic period for Central Asia, when Sogdia was a sort of ruling entity, but seemingly very divided, and you have the Sasanians to the west. There is a big gap, and that is the Karakum Desert, and it always sits outside of maps. The boundaries always stop in the Karakum because nobody knows what to do with it. Why? Because it doesn't have a city in it, and therefore people don't talk about it. So in this pre-Islamic era, before the Arab conquest, there is a big area of complete lack of control, at least according to our historical documents. What happens after the Arab conquest, indeed up through the Abbasid Caliphate, that area of lack of control, seemingly, according to our understanding, continues, or at least how we go about mapping it. And the question then is, what do you do with these areas that are in between? Certainly, these are the areas we're reliant to move across, particularly in terms of Silk Roads, but it's very difficult to understand the ways in which they're controlled. So back to the power model, if we want to understand routes and how the power structures fit within them, we need to try and figure out what's going on in these in-between regions. So this is exactly what I, some years ago now, set out to do, to look at the Karakum Desert in one particular zone, which has been, one argues, a key crossing point between this very large city of Merv, possibly the largest city in the 11th century in the world, who knows, and the Amu Darya River, the Oxus, as you might know it, which divides Khorasan from Transoxania, so a part of Greater Iran, if you want to call it that, from Central Asia, Bukhara, Samarkand, and beyond. So this is a key linkage across the landscape. It's usually characterized in terms of these nodes. And according to most traditionalists, I would call them, particularly Barthold, who's very famous, this road has always run on that axis. Okay, across the desert, has always run on this particular axis. This is the logical way to move across this desert region. So this is this was the basis, this was the framing for the book, which you can have a look at. It was to think about, what do we mean by the road that passed across that route? Is it the historical travel paths? What sort of architectural evidence, what sort of infrastructure that can we find? What can we see in terms of archaeology? Going a bit sort of further into the theory, how could we potentially model this? How could we model movement using computers and so on? And finally, how can we build in modern analogies of desert practice? So this was the sort of remit of that book. And I'm not going to go through each stage here. I'm going to try and give you a synopsis of some of the major takeaway points. We often start with historical narratives. This is one of the dreadful things about working in historical archaeology or archaeology of the Islamic period, is that usually the sources come first, even for me, which is a bit of a shame. But I wanted to give you these because they give us some reflections on some of the early sources about how people move in this region. They do refer to it as a desert. I've heard people refer to the Karakum as a steppe, but please go. It's very much a desert even now. And we hear about the use of tents. Now, this is mostly in relation to the movement of the Arab armies into Central Asia, the conquest, as it were, and the period of consolidation into the 8th century. But they're talking about using tents in the desert of Amul, as they're talking about it there. They're also talking about wells, particularly with the wells of Uthman, which I'll come back to later on. So they're using wells in the desert, and this is how they're moving around the desert, which makes very good sense. But it doesn't necessarily talk about a route. And I think we leap between moving through the desert and the existence of a road, particularly, with some ease. Because it's not until the 10th century, really, the 9th and 10th centuries, that we have anything by way of an itinerary. And what's quite curious about the Arab geographies, the geographies in Arabic at least, is that we have the mention of stations. So we've moved from a sort of generic idea of perhaps passing across the desert in any which way towards defined stations. Now, I put these as two different routes here. They're not two different routes. They are simply differences in the itineraries given between the city of Merv, which is not on there, but it's the first one, through a site that we know of, a smaller city called Kushmahan, and through to Amul, which is the crossing on the Amu Darya. The details are not necessarily important here. I don't want to go into why they're different. But the point that I want to make is the fact that we have itineraries, and they actually delineate stations, places that you should stop on this route. What does the archaeological evidence look like? Well, actually, on the ground, and this is believe it or not, this is a sum total of 5 years of research, looks like this. We do actually find a linear route. You can see a line of yellow dots. These are substantial architectural investments. These are caravanserais, we might call them, which are dotted across the landscape in a straight line, more or less, between Merv and the Amu Darya. But what we also have is an array of other sites. We have sites here characterized in red with no architecture, but have substantial evidence of pottery. So how do we make sense of this? Then this is particularly looking at a snapshot of remains from the 10th to the 13th century. I'll show you either side of that shortly. But first I want to talk about these caravanserais. They are the impressive buildings of the desert. They are, if you like, the smoking gun that we need to go towards that idea of a pathway, because here are the hostels. This is where you stay. This is by far the most impressive. So I normally show this one first. It is a double courtyard caravanserai. You can see the plan. It has this monumental corrugated facade. It has a sort of Avan structure. So anybody who's familiar with Iranian architecture will know that this is a very familiar model for what becomes sort of Seljuk and Iranian architecture in general, and a whole series of rooms, some elongated rooms around the front courtyard, some smaller rooms at the back. We could spend we can spend a long time, if you like, debating exactly the division between the front and the back, whether one is for animals and the other one's for people, whether one is for the peasants and one is for rulers. But nonetheless, this is something on a fairly grand scale, and it is right in the middle of the Karakum Desert. And we date that, and I'll come to why, in the 11th to 12th century. And it's not the only one. It's certainly the most famous because it has those standing remains. People have known about that particular site for some time, but during our survey we were looking at other double courtyard caravanserais. You'll have to take my word for it if you can't see, but there's one here and one over there, and they map very nicely onto other monuments that we know of that are far better preserved, such as Rabat-e-Sharaf in Khorasan on the Iranian side of the border, with a different proportion of caravanserais of courtyards, but also built in fired brick, so far better preserved. One of the interesting points about the monuments that I was looking at is that they are mostly in unfired brick. They're in earth architecture and rammed earth. And potentially one could imagine these also existing in other scenarios, but of course they wouldn't necessarily survive. So it's, in some ways, it's a fluke of preservation that because we're in the desert, these have actually survived, possibly better than other examples elsewhere. And then if we go back to our historical narratives, what we might imagine is that because we have these double courtyard caravanserais, that seems fairly standard, that there is significant investment in a route. This all matches very nicely, apart from the fact that the geographies are talking about the 9th and 10th centuries, and those large double courtyard caravanserais are not there until the 11th and 12th. So there's not a real connection between the establishment of way stations and those buildings, at least. And then the question is, well, what are they? There's another element which I'd like you to consider, which is the fact that they're very grand. We alluded to the fact that there's a monumental facade. We have inscriptions at Rabat Sharaf which talk about the wife of Sultan Sanjar renovating the caravanserai itself after an attack of the nomads. And so there is, we know, royal patronage in terms of these buildings. And in spite of the fact that none of the decoration survives at Akshakala, this particular site, we can imagine that it is actually fairly grand. And in fact, Yuri Karyev has pushed this even further for the site of Rabat Malik in modern-day Uzbekistan to suggest that rulers actually lived in these caravanserais. They weren't living in cities. He's talking about the Karakhanids specifically, so the 11th century, although the date of this particular caravanserai is a bit disputed. But he's suggesting that the grandeur of these places in the desert is not because of the travelers. It's because particularly nomadic or semi-nomadic rulers were living part-time and taking their entourage between these places. I personally don't agree, but it's an interesting suggestion, and they are certainly grand. We can also, to get a better impression, look at the material culture from these sites. And this is something that I'm very keen on, sort of burrowing down into the nitty-gritty, really, and not just looking at the buildings. Ceramics-wise, those of you who know anything about ceramics from Central Asia, we have a very standard urban assemblage at these sites. It's nothing particularly elite, but it is in the middle of the desert. These are being brought there for consumption in some way. They could be being traded, but in the majority of cases, there are local ceramics produced both sides of this desert. Bukharan ceramics stay in Bukhara, ceramics from Merv are from Merv. So there's not a lot of transit of most of these ceramics, unless it's really fine. But we have a lot of consumption. We do have some objects which are clearly traded, lapis lazuli, just to make sure I got some in the presentation. Found at one of those sites. And we also have coinage, which gives us a little indication of some dates. I want to bring you to some of the other sites, though, because it is actually only a handful that have those double courtyards. Many of the others have as varied forms as you can possibly imagine. And this really speaks against the idea of standardization and investment. I think because there's so much emphasis on Safavid and Qajar investment in routine and regular way stations in places like Iran, that we have this idea that at any one given time, you would know the distance between these places and that would be absolutely standardized and state-sponsored. However, as you probably saw from the distribution map, first of all, they're really not regularly spaced. They don't even align with the itineraries, unfortunately. And you have buildings like this. Now, this might be somewhat earlier. We have 9th, 10th century material from the site. It's very different. In fact, it looks a lot like the buildings from Merv, if anyone's been to Merv or heard about those. It's certainly very visible from a distance. As is this, just nearby, it's actually a watchtower on the route, somewhat later. But it just to give you an impression of the variety of different buildings. This is not something which is done systematically, I think is the point that I'm trying to make here. It is heavily invested in at various different periods, but it's not that systematic. I want to return, though, to the idea of both the chronology and these other sites, these sites which don't have architecture about them. And if you look at these snapshots, so I've given you very broadly pre-10th century CE, 10th to 13th century CE, and post-13th century, you'll see that all the architecture clusters in the 10th to 13th century. Not only that, but the route disappears. So the question is there a route beforehand? Is there some sort of pathway across the desert? And if not, what are all these other sites? So that's those, and these two, and those, if you can't see the dots. So I'm going to focus more now for the second half on those dots, just to sort of give you a summary of where we are with these architectural sites before we leave them. They don't map onto itineraries as easily as we might hope. You can fudge it and you can try and make them actually match, but in reality, there's too many of them, and the distances are difficult. The earliest architectural evidence is 10th century and not earlier. They're elaborate in scale. They do actually have fired bricks as well in part of the details, and they're all abandoned in the late medieval and early modern period, with very few exceptions, but pretty much people don't reuse these buildings. You'd think if there was an amazing fortified building in the middle of the desert, you'd actually continue to use it, but they don't. Instead, what we find is people using this, which is where I started out. And these are the types of sites that are characteristic of all of those other red dots that you saw on that map. They're well sites. They have modern occupation by pastoralist communities. I would hesitate to say nomad. Anybody who knows the Soviet Union understands the reorganization, the wholesale reorganization that took place in the 20th century. There is a nomadic element, which we can come to. But they're wells in these shallow basins that you can see here from a kite image that we did. And they have relatively small herds of sheep and goat with occasional camels. And importantly, they have ceramics, not just ceramics from the modern day, but ceramics that are contemporary with the period that we're looking at. So that's why I make a very strong argument that these wells were occupied. We can work backwards in a way. We can look at these wells which are occupied in the modern day to try and understand something of how they were used in the past. And I started to do this using Soviet maps. The details, again, are not necessarily, I don't want to go too much into it here, but what you can see is that on the whole, on the left-hand picture here of these routes and the wells are in blue, there are radial patterns out of these wells. Okay, so they're not linear patterns. The linear patterns come actually with these big black lines of the gas, the gas roads, right? So they're there to extract gas. But the radial routes really suggest that this is how you have a sort of constellation of wells, and it's very, very different to anything with a linear pattern. You do, as I say, have a limited amount of transhumance, so it's seasonal transhumance, but it's not in the sense of the steppe. It's not in the sense of what you see in places like modern Kazakhstan and southern Russia. It's actually peripatetic around this whole series of wells that's actually quite structured. And it's hard to get at what the previous pre-Soviet pattern was, but there have been to some extent some studies. The other thing which I had to sort of correlate against is whether or not I'm looking at a realistic picture of the past. Of course, I know what the Karakum Desert looks like now. It is a desert, but it's very possible that actually in the past, people could be living in these areas more permanently with a greater number of people. But what I'll do, again, for your ease, without going into the details, you can read about it in the book, is draw a straight line here. You can see that that's the current rainfall in 2000, at least that's when the study was done. And if you cast your eye back towards the medieval period, it's not a great deal more or less. Okay, so there's possibly a little bit less rainfall in the second half of the first millennium CE. Definitely not more. So this area, it's not as if this area was easier to cross or these wells were particularly fertile. And I've already mentioned that these early accounts of wells do appear in texts, Al-Tabari, for example, but they're also mentioned, or at least one is mentioned, the well of Uthman that I mentioned earlier, is actually mentioned as a stop on the itinerary. So we have a hint, even in the sources, that people are using these well stops, not the caravanserais, as the primary stopping points on routes across the Karakum Desert, or within the Karakum Desert, I should say. We also have other sources about wells. I have to get this site in because this is the site I work at now. This is the site of Dandana Khan, also in the Karakum Desert. This is our excavation project with the Met in New York. And indeed, we have sources talking about wells. This is an account of when the Ghaznavids come and the famous battle between the Ghaznavids and the Seljuks in 1040, and they find that the wells are running out. And we get accounts of the fact that these wells, although they are present in the desert, are a scarce resource. They're quite fragile. They're fragile in terms of their capacity. If you completely empty a well, it takes hours or days to refill. So you have to have the knowledge of where these wells are, but also how they function. So it's quite a technical aspect of using them. And just for you modernists, or early modernists, I threw in that Shah, because again, when we talk about military campaigns in the Karakum, it doesn't matter who it is, there is this desire to create new wells or to use the provision of wells as the means to passing through. And he talks about the fact that he's creating thousands of wells across the desert, wells which we don't think necessarily existed. It does seem like an exaggeration, but the point is there that this is how you get across. And then to the very modern period, again, Alexander Burns, Bukhara Burns, which hopefully many of you know, talks about the nature of these wells in the Karakum, their depth, the fact that this is how they're crossing, and a more local source, the histories of the clans of Hiva, talks again about how these wells are navigated. Again, the detail is not necessarily an important thing. What is important is the fact that throughout the modern period, we've gone back to a system of wells. None of these accounts talks about stopping in a caravanserai. None of them talks about a building. What they all talk about is how they navigate the desert, how they have guides who know where to go, and how they are stopping only in wells. And we have maps of where they are as well. You could sort of read into these. These are Russian imperial maps. And we have the same from the wonderful documents of the Afghan Boundary Commission, who actually also move into this area as well. The other thing I think which is quite interesting about these wells from a material culture perspective is that they are the same. I admit that these are not the prettiest ceramics you will ever see. And you'll have to believe me somewhat when they are quite representative of a whole range of different ceramics. They have, in fact, you can see a spiral design here, ceramics that go all the way back to the Iron Age, although that's a big question mark for the moment. But the more important thing is that they have ceramics which are contemporary with those which we find in the caravanserais. These are all examples from museums, just to show you what they would look like in whole. But this is the kind of things we're having represented in the middle of the desert at these well sites. And it's the same material culture as we find in urban sites. So they're clearly connected. These are not pastoralists who are existing on a very different lifestyle, who come into the oases occasionally. These are people who are connected into a system, and it's the same system, or at least I would argue, that is going through caravanserais. It's the same ceramics that we're finding at these big, call them palatial sites. To give you a photo of one of these wells and what they look like in the modern day, they're fairly deep. They're all reinforced with concrete. We can't really do much in terms of understanding the actual well points themselves, but this position within the basins seems to be the most important factor, and that's why we seem to have the longevity of use, given you this already, in terms of the modern era. So part of what I did in my research was to set out to map these, to think about the distances between them, but also to think about, go on, no? Not moving for some reason. I was going to say their characteristics. No. Oh, there we go. Yeah, yeah. Okay, it skipped a couple, but anyway, we'll go on. We'll be doing well. So these wells are both used seemingly by pastoralists historically and in the modern era, and they're used as these transit points. Is the sort of takeaway from that. And the material culture is very similar, but the majority of caravanserais, and I had a map to show you this, but is actually a long distance from wells in the modern era. So the wells are not co-located with caravanserais, which is an interesting point. You say, where do the caravanserais get their water from? We can jump back and forth, and again, as a sort of leaping in time, but in the modern era, there is a renewed interest in a particular feature of the Karakum, which is these flat clay plateaus, these what they call takis, or takir, in the middle of the desert. You can see it here. It's very flat. There's some vegetation on it, but normally that vegetation is kept off. And during periods of heavy inundation, which happen, we have the winter rains in Turkmenistan, They flood, and you can actually channel the water off because they're impermeable. You can channel the water into a repository and then keep that water for some time. So this is a modern observed technique, but we have the historical parallel in the existence of what in this part of the world we called Sardobas. You might know it as Ab Anbar. And we have very good examples, at least from the 14th and 15th centuries, in modern day Uzbekistan. Do we have them in the Karakum? Well, yes, actually, we find them in association. This is the site that that very large sort of tower structure is at. And if you look very carefully, in fact, I've probably marked it, there we go, at the aerial imagery, you can see that we have a circular structure, possibly with steps leading down into it, as you would expect from an underground reservoir. So it seems that they are practicing water harvesting. We have other examples which are even more elaborate. This, and again, I can talk about it further, is actually a circular caravanserai, not very far from the last one I just showed you. Shows you again the diversity of sites that we were looking at, but also on the southern side was there was a great number of ceramic sherds for water pipes. And you think, again, what are water pipes doing in a desert that doesn't have any flowing water? Well, the answer has already been found elsewhere. And that's a second circular caravanserai. I only know of 4 circular caravanserais in the world. One was in Iran, but I think it's become a hotel now. Yeah, so there aren't that many. But there are others in northern Turkmenistan, and if you look at, you have a channel coming in, and that reservoir, that central reservoir, which ultimately is your protected resource, right? This is the thing that you need to protect, is right at the heart of the building. And so I've hypothesized that that would be the case for this other site, which was on our survey. And if you needed more convincing, if you look at sites within 500 meters of one of those takirs, they happen to coincide with all of those ones on the trajectory running from Merv to the Amudarya. If you look at sites within 500 meters of a well, where they're the well sites, clearly, because they're at wells. But none of those, well, very few of those sites with architecture are anywhere near a well. And so this seems to be a dual system, right? You have a dual system of the wells, extracting water from the ground, using it as part of pastoralist economies, and then you have the Takia system, which is a different system running in the north. And this might be, and again, lots of data, but I can summarize it, this might be connected into salinity. Anybody who's been to this part of the world will have seen how groundwater brings salt to the surface. And this is one of the big problems with growing cotton, actually, in this area. But some of the wells are highly saline. So on this map here, the yellow wells are saline wells, at least by Soviet mapping, and the sort of bluey ones are freshwater, sweet water. And so you need to know which is which, and they have a high degree of salinity. Why? Because of human consumption, but also because of animals. Sheep and goat have a relatively high tolerance for saline water. They can deal with these quite salty wells. Camels, on the other hand, are not that tolerant. Horses, not a chance. So if you want to cross the desert on a horse, what you need is fresh water. What you need is water that has been collected from rainwater and harvested underground. You also need that if you want fresh water as a human being. We're not very tolerant of saline water either. And so the system may be reflective, and again, it's a may at this point, of the difference in water quality and actually how many humans you can support through the desert and how many horses, animals, with a given resource. And the fact that actually through wells, you're limited, again, also with the refill time, you're limited to very small numbers, and you actually have to disperse through this network of many different wells in order to take large numbers of people through it. So we have these two systems, and so the last thing I'm going to touch on really before I sort of draw you into this theoretical discussion again is the idea that these two systems, okay, one is before and after, so that we know that the wells are there earlier and they're there later, but also the wells and the routes through the wells are functioning in a contemporary way with those caravanserais. Why? Why do we have two different systems of travel? Why would you go through all of the well points with their brackish tasting water when you could just go through those wonderful caravanserais with the palatial architecture and the accommodation and all those beautiful ceramics? We don't have any direct evidence of why those systems would be, at least not that I know of yet, from the historical sources. However, you get a hint of what some of these way stations, these big caravanserais, are actually being used for, and that's surveillance. These are not just places to provide for the traveller. These are places where you spy on the traveller. In fact, places where travellers are apprehended and killed. Because that's very good, isn't it? You need to have an empire that has surveillance, and it's the routes that you have surveillance over. In fact, it's the routes where you control not only who passes, but all of the taxes, all of the extraction that an empire needs in order to make trade functional. Again, go back to that sort of trade and power model at the beginning. So we often, in sort of historical terms, think of these nomadic peripheries as being disruptive to trade. In fact, what we seem to have in the Karakum is the other way around. What we seem to have is a network which existed, a complex, convoluted network, and it existed before the existence of any linear pathway. So this urban model of trade overlies that more complex non-linear network. It overlies all of these links between the wells, which are built up over time, and it is a pastoral network, I would argue. It's based on pastoralism, it's based on seasonal movement. But the pastoral network continues. Is it a subversion of the main route? Are people going through this more circuitous pathway in order to avoid taxes, in order to disappear into the desert? I'm sure you can all think of contemporary examples. And then there's the question of caravanserais. If the nomad peripheries are not the challenge to trade, but they're the basis of trade, then we have to challenge the notion that the nomads, they're often referred to as the Turks in the literature, because of this Turk-Tajik trope. But are the nomads, whoever they are, actually the purveyors of trade, in which case, what are the caravanserais doing? Are they defending? And I've argued elsewhere that caravanserais, generally speaking, if you look at the architecture, at least for Central Asian examples, have nominal towers, little bastions on the side, and they have walls which are not very defensible. It's not really about protection. More to the point, if you're traveling in the Karakum, you'd normally travel at night when you're very vulnerable. And if you're going to be attacked, you'll be attacked en route. It's very easy to do, also when you're stretched out in a long line. So caravanserais, not necessarily about protection. Either way, the infrastructure itself is the exception to the rule of travel. That's what I'm trying to stress, at least in the early period. It is overlain on this system, and it is not necessarily needed. In fact, in most periods, we have a system which doesn't rely on infrastructure. And in most periods, that means that travel challenges imperial control, or is at least outside the purview of regional control. So for the last few minutes, I'd like to do what I said I would do in the abstract, which is all a great idea, which is to sort of set where I think we should be thinking about the agenda based on what I've looked at. And there's 3 points. The first is this reevaluation of the notion of infrastructure. I'm often asked to write about caravanserais as infrastructure. And when we were preparing documents for the UNESCO nomination of the Silk Road as a transnational World Heritage Site, the emphasis was on things that evidence movement, bridges, roads, infrastructure, maybe canals, if you like. But I think we need to reevaluate this. I think we need to think of knowledge as actually a part of infrastructure. Ibn Fadlan and the guide that takes him on his travels and how he actually moves through a landscape is a good example. We also need to think about how that builds into seasonality. These wells, this system is incredibly intricate in terms of both harvesting the water, understanding when the wells are going to be fresh, how much water there is, for how long a period that's a viable route to move between. So infrastructure also means seasons. And then finally, in terms of infrastructure, it's really about social organization. If you don't have the social connections which allow you to move across these landscapes, then you've got no way to actually stay in any of these places. So we're moving, in some ways, for infrastructure terms, away from a political centric model to one which is about social organization, and social organization of pastoralism as well, which, as you're all aware, has received relatively little attention compared to, say, urban histories. And this is especially in pre-Islamic Central Asia. I would argue that this is really where, if you want to talk about Silk Roads and Sultans, you need to talk about pastoralists. The second point really is evaluating this relationship between power and trade. So in the same vein, that probably means we need to consider these sort of subaltern, to use the modern phrase, histories of exchange. We need to move away from thinking about the links between Rome and China as being the drivers of trans-Eurasian or Afro-Eurasian trade, and think about the ways in which the people instigating the trade were those people in the middle, right? So that moving away from that model that you have the interlocutors in the center and actually thinking, okay, these are the drivers of trade, and then moving outwards into these other zones, the zones where they ostensibly don't have power. We need to recharacterize outposts, particularly places like our new site, Dandanakan, this is the city itself, and think about why they grew up, why they were placed there, and their sort of decline and fall. We need to think about social, well, sorry, that was the point before. And we therefore, because of this, need to think about the actual impact of conquest. If you do history of Central Asia, particularly between the, let's say, 9th and the 13th centuries, it is a litany of different polities or empires, if you want to call them. If it's the Samanids or the Ghaznavids or the Seljuks, what does that look like in real terms in terms of the change in people's interactions with each other? Are these disruptions? When the boundary is forged across the Amudarya, does the trade stop? Is it diverted somewhere else? Or are these systems so stable that they actually exist outside of these major political shifts, which we all read far more about because they're in historical texts? And finally, in terms of setting an agenda, I think we need more of a focus on pathways. I questioned myself considerably when I took this on to try and find pathways, because these pathways, particularly in deserts, are ephemeral. They are often difficult to trace, and sometimes it's a bit of an impossible task. However, it does allow us to move away from those nodal urban models, right? It allows us to not see routes and connections as necessarily connections between cities, but to approach a sort of whole landscape approach to movement. We can move towards understanding all of the archaeological evidence, whether that's villages, sites, wells, ceramic scatters, and understand people moving between all of them, that real complexity that I think most of us are trying to push for Silk Road models these days. I think in order to do that, we need to think through multidisciplinary methods, particularly across sort of archaeology and history, but not necessarily the macro. And this is my point also, is that I was only able to view this system by focusing in on a relatively small area. I think the temptation when we say multidisciplinary is that we have to do the whole of Afro-Eurasia, right? We have to, people looking at DNA and how people have moved across landscapes with DNA and want to do the whole of this huge region. But actually, if we look at different areas, different examples of in great detail, that might allow us to pick up some of this nuance. And then something which, just a sort of a teaser, if I were ever to come back and talk, the impact of disasters, which is something I'm working on now, particularly earthquakes, and where the sudden changes, humanitarian difficulties can actually bring about complete reorganizations. And that might also be environmental disasters as well, which of course we're very aware of. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Paul. That's fantastic. And actually, oh, I wish we could do the same sort of stuff in the Taklamakan, because there's so much little evidence to suggest the models are very similar, and it might be interesting to discuss those at some point because they're not generally picked up. But anyway, that's a different thing. Sorry. Okay, fantastic. Questions, and I'm going to ask you to speak into the mic so our Zoom people can hear.
Thanks so much for a fascinating talk. I've got two questions really. The first is there's a big gap between the caravanserais between KRS 25 and 37. Do you think that's because they weren't there, or they were made of wood, or something that might be ephemeral, or that you haven't found them that yet? And also, is there a road there now following this route? Is it still used as a trading route, or is it as a communication route?
That's both great questions. I'm fine just to talk into this one, right?
Yeah,
I can do.
yeah.
For the second question, first, yes. Part of the reason why I think at least, we emphasize that particular corridor is that when the railway was built, the Russian Imperial Railway was built, it was built along exactly that axis. And then subsequently the main road then followed, slightly to the south of where the caravanserais are, which is useful because it didn't impact them. However, the railway shifts to the north exactly in that point where you're talking about, where there's a blank gap. And it seems as though modern railway activity initially and then road construction has really disrupted that central position, which is why there's I only put on there the sites which we were able to definitively identify during the survey. There was an excellent Soviet survey that I should have mentioned, conducted by Maslova and Pugachenkova in the 1950s, which tried to do a very similar thing to what we were doing. They picked up another site, but really only described it sort of in general terms. So there probably was at least one more there. I don't necessarily think that they would have to be even though. So as I mentioned before, I don't think that we should be expecting them to regularly. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Just one general point first, which you just mentioned, the Soviets and their work, which is pretty groundbreaking. I mean, I don't know much about it, but has that, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, has that opened up research to people from outside? That's the first point I want to ask. The second is about seasonality of travel. I've seen photographs of the desert in the springtime for a few weeks, and it's very different in terms of vegetation. Was that therefore a very popular time for travel? And the final point I want to ask is about these things called kosks. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but they were kind of fortified manor houses. They were just closer to the main centers of population, is that right? They were sort of suburban villas.
Rather a lot of questions.
No, they're all great questions. They're all things that don't. So, got the first one. Soviet. Got the Soviet. Yeah. So yes, an incredibly good amount, a large amount of work was done during the Soviet Union. Again, I can talk to you afterwards if you're interested in the details. Of these huge expeditions, complex expeditions, with lots of different specialists on them. Those continued right up to the fall of the Soviet Union, and then obviously after dissolution, there was an unequal portion of resources in all of the different subsequent countries. So some countries where the heads of the institutes were, for example, Uzbekistan, had a great number of archaeologists, they had a great number of resources and sort of institutions to build from. Other countries had fewer resources, and it's taken longer for those countries to build the academic head of steam to be able to continue research in some respects. But there's a great deal of research going on in Central Asia now. The focus of it isn't necessarily on caravanserais, I would say. It's usually on sites with a little bit more prominence because, for obvious reasons. What was your second question? Sorry. Seasonality, yes. So seasonality is very difficult to grasp. One aspect that I would like to look at in future, if I have the time, is using modern scientific methods such as isotopes to look at how herds are being brought in and out of the desert. Without, again, going into too much detail, the delta systems of places like Merv is very fertile based on the water, but it requires regular replenishment in terms of nutrients. And so one method that several people have hypothesized is that herds are brought into the delta during the winter to graze on the stubble, but also to manure the fields, and then they're taken out again. And this and other patterns of isotope analysis might actually allow us to look at when people move in the year. Otherwise, it's very difficult to grasp unless you look at the modern texts and back project, which you obviously have to do with caveats. The final question was kushks. Yes, so kushks obviously cognate with kiosk, right? Okay, so the pavilions are tower structures. You find a lot of them in the cities of Merv, but you'll have noticed that there is that one in the middle. That is a kushk, essentially, on the side of a caravanserai. So we do find them in the desert. And I've written an article which is yet to come out about that very distinctive corrugated style and how even if it predates some of these buildings, it's used quite consciously as a sort of architecture of power, a local architecture of power to give a sense of height. That corrugated style is very useful in a landscape that's otherwise very beige, because what you're getting is you've got an earth material, but you have a pattern of light and shade, which gives a sense of height. It also makes it visible in the desert. So that's about the question.
I'll take this one, then I'll take you.
Thank you. Actually, I had two completely unrelated questions. First was, who built the caravanserais? Are these like put up by empires or by some sort of enterprising guy who spots a chance to make a buck from people wandering through? And my second question was the waxing and waning of the travel along this route. Is this tied up at all with long-term climate changes? Like I know it's been hypothesized that the Mongol invasions of Central Asia were during a wet phase, and I wondered if the switching from wet to dry might be what's opening and closing this route you're talking about.
Yeah, very good point. On the construction of caravanserais, again, we're reliant mostly on texts from the medieval period and late, or the medieval period is the wrong term, but from the Seljuk period and later. And because they're often endowed through the system of waqf, so religious endowment, in other contexts, we don't have examples from the Karakum. And so this idea that you might endow a building as a good deed is very common, associated, I say, with religious piety, but associated in person terms with either elite individuals, not necessarily the caliph, or indeed local governor, but other people of status. And what I find quite interesting is that either side of the desert here, you have the Rabat Malik, which was renovated by a prominent woman, the wife of the Sultan. And on the opposite side, you have hints that there's another caravanserai that may also be a construction activity of an elite woman as well. So I think it'd be quite interesting that no one's yet to piece together the evidence, but actually how this might be a way for women to exert power in the society at the time. Relating to, sorry, I think I forgot my first one.
Whether you were talking about how the route was active and then it
Oh, the ebb and flow.
Is this related, could it be related to long-term timing?
Yes, well, one of the difficulties, so I showed Philippe Sorel, sorry, has done a lot of work on the Aral Sea and the Aral Sea cores to reconstruct climate history. And the only thing that I think we have to bear in mind quite carefully is that most of these regions are climatically sensitive enough to act as microclimates. And so whilst we can talk, I mean, there are many people that have talked about the environment, and maybe it's the fact that it's a stimulus for the Mongols to move. But for that to be the case, you need to look at a sort of pan-Asian change. Whereas when you look at environments like this, they're actually far more responsive and they have different changes that don't necessarily align. And this is the reason why climate historians really argue about when the cold periods exactly were and when the warm periods exactly were. If you look at it at a big enough scale, it evens out and you can say, well, broadly speaking, it was warmer and wetter. But then when you look at something as detailed as the work on the Aral Sea, you'll notice there are vast fluctuations in periods of sort of 20 to 50 years in a general trend, but those probably had far more impact. Because if you suddenly had a period of very extreme drought, and you had no water in these wells, I think last summer, for example, then how are you going to cross? Can you carry enough water? Is that suddenly going to inflate the price of all those goods you're relying on coming from the other side? And it would be really interesting to have that level of, almost annual detail, but yeah, we're yet to get there. We need trees, tree rings would be ideal.
Yeah, and then I think if I take some online.
Thank you for your talk. It was extremely fascinating. I know nothing about the Silk Road at all, but I do know something about travel in that area, and it's damn difficult. Water or not being available, it's a struggle. You mentioned now 2 potential routes and systems for travel in that area. Does that indicate that travel may have been fairly frequent or not? And how does it impact upon your earlier models you stated on the relationship between empires, one another, or empires with an interlocutor in the middle?
Yes, good question. So in terms of the frequency of travel, and again, I'm leaping forward in ways that we can only really hypothesize about right now, in terms of the fact that it seems that there's a lot of local travel on a frequent basis because of this movement, at least the circular movement of herds and communities, and also the degree of material culture which is moving around in this desert. There's clearly a strong link. So I would suggest yes, there is frequent movement, but probably it's of the local kind through many hands rather than sort of long distance, which I guess most people would agree with. In terms of the empire model, sorry, I should have made it clear. I think both of those models in some ways are completely flawed because they prioritize the idea that it is the empires that characterize the trade rather than the other way around. You can have both models existing with that sort of undercurrent, understructure of local traders, but what they're doing is tapping into it. So in the first model, what they're doing is tapping into it in a local way by harnessing those systems and thinking through how they can manage them through local interactions. And what they're doing in the second model, when the empires expand, i.e. after the Arab conquest, writ large, is that they take over those areas and impose their own systems on them. But they don't eradicate the systems which are there. What they do is they put an imperial system, one that they can control in their own way, on top of the existing road paths.
I'm going to see if there's any online questions, which a disembodied voice will come out and tell us them if there are. Matty or whoever
hello.
is up there. Alex?
Hello, can you hear me? We do not currently, but if anyone would like to sneak one in, now is your opportunity.
Sorry, that wasn't. Did you say there wasn't one?
There wasn't one now. No, so
Excellent. Okay. Well, Lina, I'm going to let Paul have a rest because and you can, because he's given us lots of interesting stuff and answered lots of questions, and I'm sure we can all. You can ask him, quiz him over a drink, any further questions. And I just want to thank him again for a fascinating talk, and thank you all for all your questions. Okay.